Would it be great if you can be sure your customers actually cared what you're saying? Our guest today is an insider with tips that can help any business or organization find the language it needs to succeed. And from his time covering politics from the front row of history, he's got some insider White House stories you do not want to miss. In this episode, we're joined by Ben Feller. He's an award-winning writer and storytelling strategist who spent 2 decades as a journalist. This period included several years as AP's chief White House correspondent, covering President Barack Obama and President George W. Bush. Afterwards, he transitioned to business, helping companies tell their own stories better by creating the language they need to succeed. Today, he's a partner at Maslensky & Partners, a communication firm, and the author of a children's book on problem solving called Big Problems, Little Problems. Welcome, Ben. We are so happy to have you.
Arden, thank you so much, Michael. You as well. It's great to be here and chat with you both.
Yeah, so I'm dying. I mean, this, the whole thing, we got to get into it. So just from your days as chief White House correspondent, can you talk about that experience and, how important the power of language and stories are in the White House press room?
Yeah, thank you. So I think about that experience a lot. It has shaped not just the work I do now as a communication advisor, but it really shapes my whole world, because inside the West Wing of the White House, every day for 6 years, you felt the whole world come through there. It was amazing how at one moment it was incredibly intense. The pressure, the pace, the speed, and at any given moment, the president could come into the briefing room and I'd be asking the question that would drive the national debate. And at the same time, it was a place that was also funny and irreverent and hosted these great musicians and athletes coming through after their team won a championship. And all that would get mixed together into this unbelievable experience that shapes, how you live and how you think about the world. And I would walk out the driveway, the famous driveway out the West Wing, past the Marine if there was one standing guard. And I would typically think, oh my God, did I win or lose today? Did I win or lose today? Because it's a chase for information to inform the public. And it's also a deeply competitive environment against a great White House press corps. And so I would be just stuck in my own moment, and I'd wave goodbye to the Secret Service. You go out the first gate, you go out the second gate, and bang, the metal fence would clang shut, and I'm on Pennsylvania Avenue. And somebody invariably walking by would look at me. Often happened, the picture in my head is somebody with their kids. And they'd look at me, and it always was the same. It was like, hey, you just came out of there. Are you somebody important? Like, that was the look. And I would look at them back and smile and nod like, I did just come out of there. I'm not important. But I do cover some really important people and things. And then I'd snap out of it and say, I am really lucky. Like, you don't get to win every day. I'm trying to win every day. But every day I do get to be part of covering history. And so from a human level, that's how I think about that time. From a language perspective level, even though people think about covering the White House, access, proximity to power, glamour, all those things, once you were done with the reporting, how you conveyed it to the world, and in this case, because I worked for the Associated Press, I was genuinely writing for the world. Word choices mattered so much about accuracy, precision, tone, flow, all of these things. Because it doesn't really matter, guys, if you do all that and you have the story and you have the access, and then you write it in a way that is written for insiders, it's filled with jargon, it sounds like Washington speak. Like, you got to distill the nation's most important political stories in a way that everybody feels connected to. And that was both my greatest challenge and also what I love to do the most.
Did you feel you got this particular job because that was something you were already really good at, or do you feel the job sort of chiseled you into being really good at it?
That's a great question. It really was both. I think by the time I got to the White House beat, I was about 14, 15 years into my career, and I had certainly established myself as someone who could make the complicated simple, which is a big part of covering government politics, and who was deeply competitive. And if I didn't always enjoy the relentless 24/7 chase, I was pretty good at it. But at the same time, it also chiseled me because I had covered local, state, and national news, but there's nothing like covering the White House. And so it was almost like, oh, you're ready? You think you're ready, kid? Okay, here we go. And it just goes at a completely different pace. And some of that for the first year or so, I was just really hanging on. And then you feel like, okay, I got this. Because what you're doing is you're getting reps in, right? Repetitions, but you're also building relationships, you're building trust. You start to feel the difference when the AP White House correspondent comes in the room. People are now looking to you for leadership. What's Ben going to ask? The energy flips. And I think at that point, I felt like, okay, I'm really, the White House is always kind of trying to control the information, but I felt more in control of what I needed to do to be successful and run a good team.
I'm curious too, just because I think for myself, and I'm sure many of our listeners, when it comes to the role of the chief White House correspondent, is that like, it's you, there's some others who have roles or are able to ask questions too, but obviously as part of the Associated Press, that puts you in this sort of key role. Could you just paint a picture for us about what that dynamic in that room looks like? Just so
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can give you a couple examples, the sort of more routine and then the exceptional. I think they both answer your question. On a day-to-day basis, as the chief White House correspondent for the Associated Press, within the AP, within that news organization, you know, it's a title that means so much because you really are expected to run the White House operation and be the person that the president calls on first to ask the question, and to be so precise and thoughtful in your questions that whenever you ask one, it's not what's interesting to me, it's what's the question that's going to advance the story. And so in that sense, I also played a de facto role at times as a leader of the White House press corps, because the AP seat was front and center. And by tradition, a lot of the traditions have since left, you know, since I was in the job. But at the time, the AP would get the first question. And so, you know, what's Ben going to ask? What's the AP going to ask? And then the speed with which we would produce content was, you know, AP news bulletin would come out first and shape the story. And so, you know, it was the leadership of my team and of the White House coverage for the AP, but also the broader White House press corps. I certainly wasn't the leader. There were other leaders, great reporters, but I had that role often. And then in a more extreme example, I was on a trip to Afghanistan, and those trips are incredibly stressful for all the right reasons. Reporters on the trip in what we call the traveling press pool are selected by their news organizations to go, and you can't tell anybody. You're going in the cloak of darkness. They pull down the shades. You know, you go in some secret entrances to, you know, Andrews Air Force Base. You take off in the dead of night, and it's all very carefully choreographed so that nobody knows while we're in the air. The reason we don't want them to know is that we don't get shot down, right? It's really, really basic. And on one trip, the itinerary changed. And so the White House told us mid-flight, you are allowed to call your news desks while we're still on the plane and tell them the details have changed, because we had stories ready to go, right? When they said, you know, we can hit the button. And so when we called in, they said, well, the news is already out that the president's there. And it was this, I remember my heart almost stopping, because the first thing I thought was, we're going through all this trouble to keep it a secret, and I've been scooped, right, on the plane. And the second thing I thought of was like, that's really unsafe, because if they start shooting at the plane, I'm also on it. You know? And so it was just loud and chaotic. Then I kept saying, and what had happened was one of the news organizations had seen coverage that the president, like one of the army bases, had put up a podiums. Anyway, it was the word had gotten out, but the story was wrong. It had him in the wrong city in Afghanistan. It had him on the ground. We were still in the air. So now you have this issue of, forget about the embargo being broken. There's inaccurate information out there, and we're screaming at hundreds of miles an hour into a war zone. It's pitch black in the back of the plane where the press are sequestered. I didn't have time to check with anybody. I just had to make a decision. And so on the other end, I'm talking to one of my colleagues. What do you want to do? And I said, just go with it. Just go with it. Give them, I had already given them the news that we're going to stay in Bagram. We're not going to Kabul. And we're not there yet, by the way, you know? And so then the others in the press cabin heard me, and they're like, well, if AP is going with it, so we're going with it. And so there was I'll never forget how stressful that felt, because I had to circumvent all the kind of rules of engagement because the rules have been broken on us.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought it was really dangerous to have that level of incorrect information out to the world. So I just made a unilateral decision. And, when we landed, the press secretary at the time, Robert Gibbs, was making a direct line at me on the tarmac. And so we're coming at each other. And then there was a press person for the White House who saw what was happening, got right in between and said, it wasn't Feller's fault. Like, the leak was already out. He was correcting it. And so, but the president was pissed. And he took it out on Robert Gibbs. And so then on the flight back on Air Force One, Gibbs called me up and was yelling at me, right? And the Secret Service are nearby saying, like, what the hell's going on with these guys? And I'm like, Robert, why are you yelling at me? I was on the plane. I didn't leak it. And they're like, yeah, but somebody has to get yelled at, and you're the AP White House correspondent. So who do you expect me to be yelling at? Like, you're here. So for all of those reasons, it was both a practical position, but also a symbolic position in journalism. And you took the good with the bad.
That's incredible.
When it came down to it, like, again, just thinking about that pressure and coming up with the right things, the right questions. And I'm sure there were probably some where maybe you, led with a question or a statement, and then maybe later on you're like, could have done this or should have done this instead. But did you have a approach that you took to try to, because again, with the focus on the right words and knowing you had that much time, like, did you break it down to a rule set where you're like, it's never going to be over X amount of words, it's always going to use this type of language? Or was it not that as complex as I'm sure it was more complex than I make it actually, but
it was as complex as you're saying. The formula that I had, so to speak, was on two fronts. The first one was, what am I going to ask the president on the days that we had the chance to do that, which wasn't that often. But when I did, I would have to game out, here's where we are in the world today. What's the single most important question I can ask? And then think through the phrasing of that question. If I ask this, he's probably going to go here. If I ask it too broad, he's going to go back on the talking point. If I ask a 2 or 3 parter, he's only going to answer the part he wants. So how do I make this as concise and declarative as possible to try to advance the story? And so the great feeling was when he started to answer, I'm not rooting for a certain answer other than one that advances the debate. We got to make news. If he starts going back to, well, let me just set the context for how this economic recovery began. I'm like, no, I don't want the context. I've already covered that. I asked you a question. So, and somewhere in the news conference, sometimes the reporters' questions would kind of play off of each other and build, and the best part would come 18 minutes in, right? So you'd still have a really good story that the president made news, but it wouldn't necessarily be off of my question because people were kind of hearing his answers, the next question, and there was a bit of an art to that. But ultimately what you want is a really smartly worded question on the front end. And then on the back end, to your point, Mike, yeah, I mean, I would come back to my desk and think through what he said, what the news was. And then this is the most important part. What does the audience care about, right? Because everything we're talking about is inside the room. Politics, White House staff, press corps. You know what really matters? It's the people at home. So I'm writing this for who's going to see this tonight or tomorrow morning, and how do I convey this moment in American history with a sense of factual accuracy, but also, sweep. If it was a big moment, sweep and context. And how does the second paragraph move to the third paragraph? And if you're going to choose a quote, is it a great quote? And if there was color in the room, how did you weave that in? And if there was context from the Hill, how do you get that in? But you can't move it up too high because you haven't told them what the news is yet. And so that's the intellectual dance that goes into the writing. Because once you start writing for yourself and your teammates and you see how Reuters covered it and how the Washington Post covered it, you get caught in that Washington trap of we're talking to ourselves. It's not about us. It's about them.
And when you say them in that moment, though, was there a particular them that you focused on? Because them could be broad. So how do you hone it in on, like, who was the right them at that moment?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I would think about my parents reading this and how they would read it and what would matter to them if it wasn't their son writing it. Sometimes I would think about voters who I met along the way at town halls or events and people I've interviewed, because that grounds you in, if you're talking about the 14th key vote on a debt ceiling matter. If you presume that they followed the first 13, your story is going to be so off point, right? You've got to have some perspective, and if you're really close to it, the perspective just comes from thinking about, for lack of a better way to put it, real people who care deeply, have different political perspectives, but really they are trusting the journalist to let them know what's happening. And I found that I've always been grounded that way, and that's what I do in business too. And it makes it so much easier to focus, right? Focus on what's the story I need to tell.
It's fascinating. Ben, so, I mean, obviously you agree to this, but we agree too, but language being so important to winning and conveying your story, going into a very interesting election year. So what would you say our audience should be listening for in the 2024 election? And, what's going to take for a candidate to break through this time around versus what happened 4 years ago?
I think what's interesting to me about the language that presidential candidates in particular used is that there can be a perception, if you're not involved in politics, that they know what they're doing. They've looked at the polls and they figured out what they need to say today, and everything is characterized in a perfect way. What often they're doing is they're experimenting. They would never say it that way. But when slogans change and tone changes and lines of attack change, they're really trying them out in real time. And they're seeing what gets the crowd going. How is it covered by the press? Do their poll numbers go up? And so, part of what I think people should watch for is who continues to sound authentic, who continues to sort of feel in command of his or her story and has a sense of confidence in what they're saying. Because those are the folks that ultimately tend, to succeed, because they're not all over the place and they're not sort of poll testing language. They're speaking with authenticity and conviction. And you often see those, those moments when you see them. They're like, oh, okay, that sounded real. That sounded like the so-and-so I remember. And so I would look for those moments of authenticity. And also what I would do as a reporter is, there's a sameness to the debate. And what really gets interesting is when something sounds a little bit different. I remember one time when I covered President Bush, and this is going to feel like a long time ago to some of your audience, but during the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, every day was some sort of update, and it sounded procedural and mechanical, and they shouldn't have been. It was about war and life and death. And one day, President Bush came out and said, I just got a briefing from my generals, and we're seeing some durable gains. Now, that quote might sound pretty vanilla, but I remember looking at my colleague, Jennifer Lovin, and our eyes lit up because we had heard him talk about updates on the war hundreds and hundreds of times. It's the first time we ever heard him say durable. Something in that briefing signaled to him that we have a set of confidence that we've turned the corner. And he was counting on somebody who's been paying closely attention to seize on that word, which we did, right? And that's how, if you're listening closely, as a reporter, you can tell a better story to the public. If you're listening closely as a voter, you can start to see like, okay, is this person someone I can trust, authentic, and have they gotten onto something? So those are the cues I'd be listening.
When I think about what's been happening the last few months with some of the presidential debates and Trump kind of playing his own sidebar game, who, in your opinion, has stood out as even having a chance against Trump?
Well, I mean, the pickings are few right now. I mean, as we're talking about this, in the last week, you saw Chris Christie drop out. It's hard to even think about some of the folks who have dropped out over the last few months. Remember, it was a big deal that his running mate, Mike Pence, was going to run against him. He suspended his campaign. What I think is, again, having covered this a long time, most interesting to me is we're finally about to get to the point where we won't have to speculate who's got a chance. We'll know because we've got the Iowa caucuses coming up. And then we'll start to see, votes come in. I think that a lot of America, as we talk in January, is not invested in this yet. Mm-hmm. It's not a political campaign yet. It's a caricature of one. with headlines and dueling events and some people who they don't even really know yet. So a lot of what you're seeing in the polls is for former President Trump is name recognition from last time, not necessarily they absolutely want to vote him in again. Same thing for Biden. So it would be surprising to me if one of the Republicans at this current stage could overtake what he's done. But, and here's the key but, that nobody really likes to think about is events change. Events change. Think about where President Biden was, right? Just at this stage when he was running for the Democratic nomination. His fortunes turned when the presidential campaign turned south, you know? But if you were going to start talking about, let's say, South Carolina right now, what are you talking about? We haven't even done Iowa yet. We haven't done New Hampshire yet, right? But events change how we see folks. And so that's why talking about kind of how it's going in January at this point, I'm like, let's see how this plays out. Let's see how what happened on January 6th and other events play into, how people see Trump. I'm telling you, a lot of people who are going to vote in this election, they're not thinking about it yet.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure Mike would agree with this. We can go on for a very long time talking about politics and the election this year, but to kind of pivot a little bit. I mean, what you did for 20 years and, a subset of those 20 years as the chief White House correspondent sounds so fascinating. What prompted you to make a shift to now trying to become a storytelling strategist for businesses versus, AP?
Well, I appreciate that. It sounds fascinating, and it was fascinating. What comes with that job is absolutely all-consuming. I had lunch with my boss at the time, and he said, this has never been a job, and it's never been a career. It's a life. And that might sound dramatic or overwrought to your audience, but it really was. And so you've got to decide if you want that life for your whole life, then go for it. I became a dad. I had changing interests in my life. I really, for all of the good moments about challenging a president, there's also lots of moments where you're sitting around at fundraisers waiting for things to happen and you miss key events in life. I was 40 years old and I wanted a different life. The other thing, so that's kind of the lifestyle answer, but the other thing is that there's a real fascination that I have in learning new things. And for me, the change was instead of knocking down the door to get in the room to find out what's going on, what if you're in the room and can help shape decisions about how a story is told and learn business and learn how to take on big, sweeping strategic challenges that a business has, but be able to do it better than anybody else because you understand the right language that can move opinion. That interested me in a different way. So you've got sort of doing one thing for 20 years, wanted to do something different, wanted to have a little bit more control over life, and this whole intellectual challenge of going into business. And for me, that was really what animated my thinking and so now I've been deep in that conversation arc for 10 years. And it's often fascinating in a totally different way because once you're in the room and you hear these big corporate challengers about reputation, public perception, responding to crisis, creating new products, scientific discovery, but how do we talk about it in a way that makes people care? Who can help us with that? Well, if you've been doing it in journalism and you hustle and you understand business, you're in a great position to do that. And so that's why it really appealed to me.
I'm curious too, as you say this, and maybe opening a little can of worms here, but it's, I think, an example that's recent in people's memories when it comes to maybe the things that weren't what the audience was looking to hear. Bud Light and what they ran into with their recent or campaign, or however you want to say it, wasn't even too long of a campaign. In those situations, do you think that is, and I'm asking you to speculate a little bit here, but when conversations like that and stuff happen behind closed doors and they're thinking about how, or I say behind closed doors, but just when they're thinking about how they're positioning themselves and their brand, do you think that was a situation where they weren't thinking about what their audience needed to hear and instead were thinking about what maybe they thought they should be doing as a company, or how to
Yeah, no, sometimes you have just strategic blunders, right? We're shifting directions and we've fundamentally miscalculated what our customer base needs to hear. And sometimes you have events that don't seem like, or campaign ideas that don't necessarily seem like they're going to be a big idea, but they turn into existential threats to your business model. And you're like, well, we probably should have had the big strategic discussion, right? Across all of our audiences and all of our internal communications before we did it. I think the through line on cases like what happened with Bud Light is, what are you doing before you do something big or potentially big? To not just focus on what you're saying, right? We're gonna target a new audience demographic, and we're gonna bring in a transgender influencer, and but how is it going to be heard? And how is it going to be heard among our core base? And maybe you do it anyway because you're trying to signal certain thing either in your agenda or you're trying to grow your customer base. But maybe you're going to hear something that says, this is not the right moment to do this. And either way, why would you go with language that you think would work when you have the option of going with language that you know will work? And that's really the fundamental case in the business that I help lead here. Is Mizlansky and Partners, our firm, is built on a premise that it's not what you say that matters, it's what they hear. And when you have language on your side that your audience says, I get it, I understand it, I care about it, and I actually want to do something with that language. If you have the ability to do those things, then that's the right investment. You can do it without. And a lot of companies have great people internally who run their communications, but the power that comes with knowing what your audiences want to hear and it is profound. And the problem, Mike, is that some places just don't, they have trouble anticipating what could happen because they don't see that the same word, the same message means something so different to somebody else, right? They actually would, if they thought about it, they'd say, oh, no, I would do it again. This is exactly what we mean. And if you don't know how it's going to be heard, you put yourself in a really dangerous position, maybe not on routine things, right? But on something like you mentioned with Bud Light, it's a thunderbolt to some of their customer base. What are we talking about here? Is this the same place that, has been selling me my beer for years, or maybe they'll say, hey, this is great. I embrace their move towards diversity, but what a risky value proposition to go out without knowing.
Yeah, it's like, I guess in that case, identity shift almost, and for, that a lot of their buyers weren't expecting or used to, and when they identified so much with this brand of what it was before, now suddenly it's this switch, it's could be a bit shocking. Every time you mention whether it was around how you hope to strategize there, as well as even when you mentioned back with the White House, I can't help but picture the scene from, I'm trying to think which, was it Avengers Infinity War, where Doctor Strange has to sit there and imagine every possible outcome that's going to happen and then he's like, yes, we have one chance and let's go for it. Because I do think there's some of that, because you have to play out almost each storyline to make sure that, okay, this one here looks like it's probably going to stand the best chance. I'm curious, is there some testing that happens with that as well? I would assume so, but because you might think it's something, and maybe in some cases, actually, you might get involved with the business and you're not their customer. So in that case, you trying to make sure you understand how they would do it. What does that process look like?
Yeah, well, first of all, I appreciate the Marvel reference, because now I'm part of a podcast that my son, for the first time, will be interested in hearing. Because typically if I'm on it, he's like, "That's nice, Daddy." Yeah. The research is a fundamental part of the work and what we do. I mean, at a very straightforward level, if you're going to go out there and make the pledge, as we do, that it's not what you say, it's what they hear, you better be sure that you've heard them. And so we have lots of ways that we do that, depending upon what we're being asked to do. And it typically boils down to getting in front of people, right, through the right focus groups and listening sessions. And then if there's something that we want to take into testing at a big level with scale, then we can go into surveys. The important thing to know about all that is that it's the tools and the research are important, and there's a rigor to it and quality, but you got to know how to convert it. How do you convert it into language that is always going to be clear, audience focused, distilled, crisp. That's because some people who engage with us, they're like, oh my gosh, can you help us figure out what our audiences care about? Can we inspire them and help them and envision that they were going to, dream bigger and buy our products? And yes, we can find out what we'll do that. But other folks love the other part of the equation, which is, can you give us the language? Like, we want to know the right words in the right order in the right way. And also, one big thing that we do is, it's not just what to use, it's what not to use. What language not to use. I'll give you guys one quick example of this that we're spending a lot of time on. One of the big debates in American politics and corporate America right now has to do with ESG, environmental social governance. And why this is important is that acronym, ESG, has become toxic in so many circles that companies are now staying away from the term, or maybe even backing away from it. And when we say ESG, it could be how you care for your employees, how you invest in the environment, what are you doing to show transparency about where the money's going in your company. And so we've done a lot of research on this, and it leads to the fact that if you just reframe that one term from ESG to responsible business, the polling that we did shows the jump in support goes up, almost 40 points for Republicans and independents. And so it's so hard in this country to get a shift in opinion. Everybody's polarized, right? And the independents play this outsized role. But if you could say, you know what, do you actually understand what we're talking about? Here's what we mean. You care for your employees. You run a profitable business. You use the money to make money, but you also use it to advance, betterment in your community. And you say, what do you do? Oh yeah, I'm for that. I'm for that. I'm for that. I'm for that. Why don't you just say it like that? So the idea lives, but the language is dated, and that's how you win.
It's really interesting you said, and again, for me too, I know I keep bringing up these controversial topics perhaps, but when I look at and think about what Disney and DeSantis and sort of that, and it's so interesting there because it can be, on one hand, some are shaping it as the battle of business and how involved somebody can be, but on the other hand, it's shaping it around the idea of who's telling our children, what to do. And when you look at it though, half the time you're like, wait, those are stories you're hearing. But in the end, some of those things boil down to stuff that wasn't actually ever even that story, but somebody controlled the narrative in a way that suddenly that becomes the story, which sometimes I think brilliant, whoever, was able to change that. But on the other hand, you're also like, dang, it's so hard sometimes to find the truth and the reality to it out there, because something can mean multiple things to, different people.
Yeah. Well, the difference there is, if you're a company or organization that is trying to convey something complicated and you want to make it simpler, that's a tough challenge, but at least it's a straightforward challenge in the sense it's not controversial. Like, we're trying to get our story out better. In the case of Florida, Disney versus DeSantis in Florida, the issue was, no. We want there to be controversy. We want there to be division. We want people to align with us that these are bad actors telling, your kids what to do. And so they're not trying to get at the root of how do we come together around language that works. They're trying to say, how do we advance our political agenda by saying, these guys are an example of what I'm running against. I'm for you, they're against you. And they don't want nuanced debate. They don't want audience testing. They don't want simplified language. They want to win the day. And so, that's where, when there's confusion around a term, it creates such an opportunity for critics.
Interesting. And it's just also interesting there, again, just taking it back to the language side of it, about how each person, just by shaping that language, not even a huge difference, but just in how they end up conveying their story to, ignite other people's and their feelings and strengths around it. So
definitely comes down being the battle of language. It's just back and forth, and to figure out, and from an audience perspective, which side you start taking, and then whichever side you gravitates towards. It seems like once you've made a decision that you're going to say, I'm on this side, and that's part of your identity, so you're not going to switch anymore. So now you double down on making sure that what you believe in is right. So, and it becomes this interesting tennis match. I'm just really curious, Ben. Sure, smaller companies might not have these big marketing and PR departments, but big corporations do. Why would they still need your help? If I mean, are their marketing teams and PR firms just not able to figure out the language?
No, well, there's a couple things, in that question. So let me unpack it. First of all, the bigger companies also have bigger challenges. So, just because they have the budgets to have their own advertising, marketing, and communications teams, they also carry these deeply complicated, interwoven global strategic challenges. And so the bigger they get, and oftentimes they need the help the most because they need an outside perspective and someone who isn't caught up in their day-to-day challenge to come in and fix it with them. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that, the communications teams at a lot of these companies are truly excellent at what they do, either in terms of thinking creatively about their ad space, how they show up in the social digital space, and their relationship with the media, earned media, public relations in that sense. What we do, and the reason why we have a niche, but one that I think has really broad application, is we're not talking about those things. Our work informs those. What we're talking about is what we call language strategy, which is how do you come up with exactly the right language to make audiences listen, care, and act. And oftentimes the folks inside these companies don't have either the bandwidth to focus on that, right? They're focused on the day-to-day. They don't have the particular expertise. They might be trained in writing or in media pitching, but they don't have the research backing, right? Or they've got some combination, but they don't have both, right? We're taking the research and then converting it into language and then helping them execute on it. And so it can't be really overstated how much even the smartest companies often are productive because they know where to go for help. And I'm not just talking about our field, right? In all kinds of fields. Who do we go to help us solve something tricky? We're not brought in when it's, can you help us, kind of roll out this new thing that everybody already loves. Where we're typically brought in by a big company is we've got a sticky, tricky business challenge and language is right in the center of it. Can you help us?
There's another interesting thing too, I think that sometimes happens in the perspective of Art, and I saw this at Disney. Interestingly enough, he's now on the consulting, side with Disney, but where sometimes internally at the companies, they have troubles either making the decision or they're infighting sometimes too in some companies, and sometimes being able to bring in that outside who they then say, okay, we completely trust that they're going to help us get there because it doesn't feel like it's internal politics. It just feels like the expert coming in to help guide us. And I know that made a big difference there, and where consultants were often used on that front. And then I think to your point, just that expertise that somebody can have, because back to what you said, I haven't heard anybody talk about language in the way you had. I understand copywriting. I've heard people talk copywriting, but that's not to say this doesn't have some sort of a piece in that world, but where you're going with that is a different depth and focus around it.
I appreciate that. And it's because of our belief and our business model is that language and communications and writing are not the things that you do at the end when you've already decided on the strategy, the hire, the product, the service, the market, the announcement, and we should probably get somebody to write something about that, right? Our view of language is it's at the center, right? That language is how the world is run. And if you think about it that way, it increases both the stakes and the importance of it, but also it's really empowering because if we could get this story right, let's say you're trying to communicate to customers, but also you've got regulators, and then you've got partners, you've got investors, you got state policymakers, you got folks on the Hill in Washington. Wow, we've got language that has to communicate all of this with precision and accuracy and power. We got to do that all the time and be mindful of the competition. That doesn't sound like something siloed in the PR department. That's a core dynamic of your company that you need to be thinking about. So when you put it that way, how do you get that right? And that's where, for us, the opportunity comes in, and also the fulfillment, because we're really helping to shape stories with our clients.
Do your clients often at that time, does it force them to take a stand themselves around certain things? And what I mean by that is a company might say, hey, we want to be, call it an employee first company. We're going to focus on what the team members themselves what we believe is important for them, but then that might mean that puts them at odds a little bit against what, whether it's regulators or whatever else says out there. It's probably regulators, not the best example, but do you find that it forces them to have to really decide who they are, or do you try to find usually a happy medium that actually allows it to still speak to both, or is it client dependent?
So it depends on the challenge. We certainly have some clients who are very clear about who they are, and where they need help is in the language that will help them achieve their business objectives, and they bring us in to do that. But very often, Mike, you're right. Even if this wasn't the intent, the work that we do in asking questions about who are you, what do you do, how is it different, and why people should care. Those are the 4 questions that I've built my practice and thinking around for years. When you get to who you are, what you do, they typically are pretty good at that. That can certainly elicit internal debate, especially if the world is changing and they have new leadership. The last 2, how you're different and why people should care, they often get stuck on because they haven't really thought through. It's not just about us. It's about us versus all the other people who are saying the same thing. And if you force the question about what really makes you different, it can go where you're going, which is, are we? Like, are we actually different? Do we have the talent? Do we have the capabilities? And if we don't, it's not a language question, right? We have to up our game competitively. Thank you, Ms. Lansky and Partners, for forcing us to think more strategically. And the 4th one about why people should care, they often miss completely because they're like, well, they should care because we're doing it.
Yeah.
Like if they only would pay more attention, it's like, no, you have to. The facts do not speak for themselves. You have to speak for them. You have to tell the story in a way that people care. And so, but if you get all 4 of those right, that has this other dynamic, which you hit on here, internal alignment. So often the projects that we do are intended to get outside audiences to listen, but they have this dual effect of getting internal audiences aligned. So what will happen is, and I was thinking about this when you're talking about Disney, is we get brought in, and once we start to get somewhere and get some buy-in, the client will say, hey, we also need to present this to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. What they're saying is like, you need to help us get internal buy-in because we love this. And now if we could get the marketing side and the C-suite, right, bought in with this, now we're going somewhere. And we're thinking like, sure, we'll do that. But wasn't that implied when you hired us? We're like, oh no, we realize now, like, we've got to get ourselves going as well as get the other folks going. And so, that the internal unpredictability dynamics of corporate America and the dynamics within a company are really interesting. They can be super frustrating, but that's part of what you deal with, and it's part of what we're supposed to be doing.
I love it. And I can imagine too, when a company is acknowledging that I believe it's a healthy place to be at, even though there may be some turmoil sometimes inside. Maybe it's not, maybe they are in a good place. But like what you had just, described, makes me think a lot about that difference between whether it's a large company, whether it's a small company. Those that I think, more of an opinion here, but that stand out really well with their team and or with the community are those who probably answered those questions that you had said before. And those are really powerful in their own right. And as I think about it, it's like, wow, yeah, that's Artin and I, in the, our past, we would go through certain exercises, questions with our team as kind of a reflection point, but never really gone through that set of ones that you just said there, even though I know sometimes it's at a company level. We looked at it sometimes just within our own department in that level, because I think no matter where you ask it, including in your own home in some ways, when you start thinking about language there, can have quite the impact. So I'm going to take those and borrow those questions.
There are yours to use. And I think, look, the part of the fun of this is that, and the rigor that goes into it is when you ask those questions and the ones related to them, to the right audiences inside a company, a university organization, I love when you can hear people struggling to get to like, what is the right answer? Like, what do we see? How are we different? What is the first sentence of us? And so when people come to me, and they're in career shifts, and this happens all the time, because they say, you've moved from journalism into business. I'm thinking about doing that. How do you do it? I see you switch, can you help me? And there's lots of different ways to think about it. Networking, who do you know, right? I always say, you got to get the first sentence of you down. If you go into a conversation And people are sort of like, so what are you exactly? Or no, you were a journalist. So you're a media guy. So you're an intermedia guy? No, you're a business guy. Wait, it's like, no. I am going to expect that kind of reaction. I'm going to make this so easy for you. And so, I challenge, my peer set, like get the first sentence, get the first paragraph of you, nail it, love it. And then you start to go into conversations and like, oh, wow, look how they reacted because you're just so clear about it. Tell me more about that. That's the work that I love to do.
And I feel like companies that are able to answer those questions very clearly and without fumbling are the ones that are very clear on their mission. And it's not just a mission that's on a website, just there. They actually abide by that mission. And you could tell in their products and in the employee, everybody just follows that ethos. And it's just great to see.
Yeah, you can tell. You can tell when they've got it right. You can tell from the first look at the website, from the first advertisement, like, oh, they got it. They nailed it. I don't need to go to the mission vision statement, which tend to be sort of internal anyway. What are they saying to me? I mean, one of my favorite quotes from a client was when we put up language to describe this organization, and he cringed and he thought that like this was a draft of where we're headed. And we're like, no, we just want to ground you in your current story. That's what you use. He's like, we're using that now? Like, yeah. And he's like, this is what we always do. We start with a clear description that matters. And then somebody weighs in and somebody else weighs in. And now we got to please everybody and we can't offend anybody. And we end up in the mushy middle and it says nothing and it looks like oatmeal. And I hate oatmeal. And he pounded the table. And I just thought like, I'm like, I actually don't mind oatmeal. But the point is that if you're mushy, if you're trying to say everything, you're saying nothing. And we absolutely steer our clients away from that point of view.
That's great. Mike mentioned that, he's going to steal those questions for his personal needs. And you did also talk about how, just the power of strategic storytelling and language is not just business, but life as well. So I'm just curious, like, how would this help parents and families, leveraging the right language? And obviously you wrote a book about this too. So, how does that all tie in?
I love the fact that I've done some living. I've been around a while, and I've been reflecting about the different chapters of my own story. So we've talked about the White House time and a long journalism career and business counsel. The other chapter is the book I wrote, which is called Big Problems, Little Problems, and it's a tale of how to solve life's daily frustrations from the point of view of a father and a son, written about my relationship with my own son. In response to your question, the language that we bring into the home follows these same themes, right? What are they hearing? Well, who's the they in this case? It's often your children, it can be your partner, can be your siblings, but what are they hearing? And so when I was raising my son at a young age, and he would get frustrated, like can't zip a zipper. And so the first thing I did was I get down on one knee. So I was eye level. Let's lower the temperature, right? And then let's take 3 deep breaths to get back to a place where we can actually have a conversation. Okay, now what's wrong? Every child understands what's wrong. I can't do this. Okay, well, let me help you do this. We zip the zipper and now you do it. And then we celebrated the win with a handshake and said, okay, listen, I don't want you to get frustrated. Don't get frustrated. And he looked at me and he's like, I don't know what that means. Like, I know everything else you did. You helped slow me down. You fixed the problem. You let me do it. Frustrated. I said, it's that feeling you get in your chest when it just doesn't feel good. He's like, okay, now I know. And so there was a time when I got stuck in traffic coming back into New York City. And I won't say what I said here because, I don't want to get in any trouble, but I'm a former journalist. I've got some saltiness to my language. And I just let it loose because I was supposed to be in the easy pass lane and we were not moving, guys. Every single cycle. And I just said something that was incredibly frustrating. And my son was in the car seat and he said, Daddy, don't get frustrated. Big problem, little problem. And I was looking in the rearview mirror. And so, okay, first of all, they're always listening. Second of all, I got through because what did I do? He heard me. And the third of all, when you teach a story that matters to somebody and they're a good person, they want to share it back. And so he did for me. And that's what the book is about. And that you see that story play out in the book is that frustration, perspective, patience. That's the language of life in the home. And I love that he taught that back to me. And we've had a lot of fun as he's gotten a little bit older sharing that story. He likes that his image is on the cover of a book, and he had a little moment on national TV. But mostly, he'll still come over to me, and this happens. I'm sure it happens to you guys. I'm sure it happens to your folks listening. Doesn't matter how much. I've written a book about this, as you said. I remember this week just sitting down. I hadn't even taken my coat off, and I was like, I don't know what to do first. And he just came over and gave me a hug. Big problem, little problem.
I'll admit my kids are now going to weaponize it against me because we read through the book together. And so now I do anticipate and not anticipate. It's already happened a few times where they've said that to me. I'm like, dang it. Okay, yes, I got it. No, it's definitely, I love the lesson in there, and great that your son gets to, have that lesson, but then even louder because it is a book out there for everybody to enjoy and benefit from.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
That right there just shows how emotion is so important, what you were talking with your son about. But how about in the business side? I mean, is it important to tap into emotion when you're crafting a message?
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good point. I mean, look, we're having a spirited conversation, but this is a conversation about language and business and life at, a rational level. People respond to language often at an emotional level. What makes them cringe? What makes them joyful, frustrated, unhappy? You think about the stories that stayed with you at the end of last year. Everybody has these lists and they're doing reflections. I'm like, what is it? Well, it was the ones that stayed with you mattered to you, and they mattered, not so much intellectually, but emotionally. Were you moved? Were you angered? Did you say, oh my gosh, have you seen this? It did something. It made you laugh, made you feel. And so when we're doing our work in business, we are looking for and testing for emotional reactions, visceral reactions. And the really interesting part, people talk about research, and it can sound really academic. The research we're talking about when we're meeting with folks face to face or on calls is that they're like, I hated that. Oh yeah? Why is that? Every time I hear a company say that, they're talking right over my head. I would never shop there. Like, okay, great. We want that. We want that reaction, right? We want to know what people are feeling, because when you're able to craft language that you say, listen, we can go back to our clients and say, when you say it this way, they're like, oh, okay. I get it now. Tell me more. It's amazing. And they're not saying it in a rational way or an intellectual way. They're saying, I felt something different when you said that to me. And you want people, like what we always want, and the three of us are doing it, is you nod along. You're like, aha, every time you can get to an aha moment, think about when you go, aha, you're not saying aha rationally, like, aha, I just discovered something. You go, aha, or like, oh, there are my keys.
Yeah.
Or aha, oh, I figured out how to get that plane ticket. Like it's a feeling. And that's why emotion is so important in language.
Michael and I were talking about this recently based on a book that we're both reading, but how important that emotional aspect is to motivation and drive as well. I mean, it's all, without it, it just seems like it's just words. But if there's emotion tied to it, it actually prompts action, which then becomes very powerful.
Absolutely.
When you think about when George W. Bush was in the office, communication and tools were very different back then, even from President Obama's days. But looking at today, with the rise of social media and Twitter now being X and all the other type of tools out there, how has this changed to tell stories and communicate strategically? How's that evolved?
I'm a bit old school about this point in one way. I think that successful organizations absolutely are adept at changing to the tools of communication. Very good at visual storytelling, very good at conveying emotion. So that can be done through marketing, advertising, social channels like TikTok, YouTube, X, all that. Fully support that. But I think when most people talk about the current channels and tools and media outlets that are folding and new ones that are emerging and how people get their news and all of that, to me is a conversation about the how, the channels. And what always stands out to me most is the what, is the story. that ultimately people still gravitate around what's happening, what's fresh, what's new, what do I need to know, and are you framing it in a way that makes me feel and care and get inspired? And those things are not driven by TikTok versus X versus podcasts versus books. Like, those are the vehicles. It's about the story. I always feel strongly like if you get the story right, then you can figure out how best to communicate. And again, I am not diminishing those things. A lot of my best work for clients has been converted into these incredibly atmospheric videos, right? With the music and the narration of the videos, and like, oh my gosh, you bring it to life. Like, that's the synergy you want. But you got to have the story right, because otherwise what you have is you have subscribers, you have followers, right? You have volume, you have content, but what's that actually adding up to? Have you moved people? Have you gotten action? That's what I care about the most, and where I kind of steer the conversation. I don't know if you guys believe that, buy into it, but that's what I believe.
And when you say it, I can't help but think about it. Again, Art and I, coming from media industry, it's like, oh yeah, you have the movie, the story, and then ultimately how you distribute it. You can distribute it, multiple different ways, and you could tease it multiple different ways. But the one thing that, but again, it's key still is making sure you have the right story. What is the message? What are you trying to get out there? That said, I do wonder though, because today somebody can go and make a statement that their whatever distribution arm, we speak of when it comes to social media or regular, media, it can get out there. And sometimes that one thing can reverberate. And sometimes that could be in a positive way, where all of a sudden talk about somebody or something going viral, or it can, nobody hears it and it doesn't matter. So there is this thing with that art, I feel like, where because something might get out to that distribution medium that was not a properly baked message or a brilliant message, it does feel like it at least gives you access more quickly to the audience, because, in your, days of White House, I needed stuff like that. It's like, well, you had the channel to get it out there, to the world, but now everybody to a degree has that possibility. So that's the piece that for me does become really fascinating, because again, it could be dangerous or not. And then there's those who can recover for it. I mean, Trump, I still look at it at times, I'm like, how the heck did he do that? Something could come out that would be, cancel for others, but somehow he has a way, back to language, I'm sure there's different ways you can look at him and say, where all of a sudden there's this quick pivot on it, and where somebody else would have got buried by the thing, he and others are able to quickly actually just almost weave it into the story and bury it. It's an incredible thing to watch. So anyways, so that's where I think people do have access that they maybe didn't before, for better or worse.
Absolutely. And for better or for worse, they do. And I generally think that access is a good thing. It's how it's used and whether people are relying on it to the point where they miss the broader story, they miss depth and context. And that's where, we were talking earlier about, an earlier conversation about debates, is how do we, if debate's 90 minutes, great. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's all talking over each other. So you want to have this mix of access and a compelling way to tell stories and video clips and all those things. But you also got to have some sense of like, what does it all add up to? Who's putting it into context for me? And that's where I was just sort of raised that way journalistically. And I think the best marrying of the two is when you do both. When you have sort of like old school traditional media, but you also have aggregation, you have video clips, right? And you've got alerts on your phone. All of that makes for just a well-rounded, more enjoyable experience, I think.
Ben, this has been a fascinating conversation. I was just going to say, to wrap it up, I want to take it back to your White House days. Is there like a juicy or kind of embarrassing story that you can share with us from those days? An interesting story?
Yeah, well, there are several. I'll tell you the one that's most embarrassing to me. That's probably safest. So I was on my first foreign trip with President Bush, which was a big deal. We were crossing Africa late in his second term of his presidency, and it took a lot for me to earn my way onto that flight. I was not going to let it go. And somewhere between Ghana and Liberia, I got really sick. And to the point where I had to, before we left the country, started flying home, it was so bad I had to get in the president's motorcade in the ambulance.
Oh, wow.
And we're usually the press pool has its own van or two. And I wasn't in my seat. And so my press corps were like, oh my God, Feller's on his first trip and we lost him. Like he's never going to be allowed back. And I was in the ambulance. And so I thought, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. I'm going to have to call my boss and let him know. I have to. So I called my boss, and instead, one of my colleagues answered, and she didn't give me the answer. She said, Ben, listen, the president's going to have a news conference when you fly home, and I know they're not going to let you file a story, but find a way to file a story. It's all on you. All right, here's the. And I was like, okay, so keep in mind, I'm really sick when I'm telling the story, and I'm brutally embarrassed because I'm in the ambulance. And I get my boss, and he's like, hello. I said, hey, Terry, it's Ben. Yeah, listen, the president's probably going to have a news conference on there, and don't screw it up. I'm like, I got that. He's like, okay, you already covered that? Also, we are so over this trip. I don't want to read one more word about this trip. I forgot you guys were down there. Are you ever coming back? I'm like, yeah, we're back now, coming back now. He's like, all right, well, whatever you ask him, don't make it about this Africa trip. We're over it. Ask him something forward-looking. I'm like, yeah, I was going to ask him about the terrorist surveillance vote last year because he's next week. He split with his own party. He's like, oh, good question. All right, well, we'll see you when you're back. I go, no, wait a minute. He's like, what? I go, I called you. He's like, oh, what's going on? I'm like, yeah, I just wanted you to know, since this is my first trip and all, I feel like I had to tell you, I'm in the ambulance. He's like, which ambulance? I'm like, the president's ambulance. He's like, I said, he goes, oh, so now I could hear the other team members and our White House team listening in, and they're like, you're in the ambulance. Like, well, my gosh, you're sick. What's it like? I'm like, it's everything, man. I go, I can't breathe. I'm sweating. He goes, no, I don't care about you. I'm saying, what's it like? What's it like in the ambulance? Like, do they have special stuff in there? And so I could hear like my team is saying, steal us some stuff, like grab some ambulance stuff. Like, what are they, I'm like, oh my God, what kind of job is this?
Branded ambulance or something. Yeah.
What, So we get to the tarmac, and I'm just crawling up the back steps, and the other reporters came in and like, oh my gosh, you look terrible. Don't worry about it. Whatever happens on this flight, we got you covered. And sure enough, one of the press aides came back and said, as soon as we get airborne and we're level, president wants to have a news conference. And my colleagues from the other news outlets are like, we got you. I'm like, I can't miss it. I just can't. So I go in there and I lock eyes with President Bush, and he goes, yeah, how you feeling? I'm like, all right, I'm good. I hated that I was drawing attention to it. So we sit down in the president's conference room, President of the United States, First Lady, Chief of Staff, Secretary of State, and Dana Perino was the White House press secretary, said, okay, let's get started. We all know Ben Feller isn't feeling well, so we'll keep this moving along. President said, well, this has been the best trip of my presidency. Best one. I'm like, oh my God, are you kidding me? The trip to Africa at year 8 in the last month was the best one. He was so jazzed because he was doing really good work down there. And so he's like, all right, I'll take some questions. And the first reporter asked him about a guy running for president named Barack Obama. And basically, what if, what would it mean for the country if, coming here on this trip in sub-Saharan Africa, if a African-American won? And he's like, I'm the president. Like, we just had the best trip of my life. If you want to ask me about that, we'll talk about it. Next question. So the next reporter asked basically the same question. So now the president is pissed. And he goes, if you guys want to talk about politics, you can talk about politics on your own time. I'm the president of the United States. Feller. And at this point, I'm in such bad shape. And I go, yes, sir. And he goes, how you doing down there? I go, he's like, I have asked you 3 times and you will not answer me. Now, keep in mind, I don't remember him asking me 3 times, right? But I said, I have answered you. I said, I'm hanging in there. He goes, well, have you vomited today? and the whole room, the sound of that laughter will never leave my ears. They're like, if the president's asking you how you're doing, that's bad. And so I was able to pull it together, ask my question, get it back, come back, write my story. But if you look in the annals of Google under Ben Feller and vomited, you will see for history the president asking me. That's how my first foreign trip went. I was a stellar trip, but I lived to tell.
That's hilarious. I actually have one more question, I think, but it'll be a quick answer, I think. Not a lot of people can say that they've sat in front of both George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and sometimes in one-on-one situations. Which one's funnier?
They're both surprisingly funny. I'm not sure about the comparison. I think I had more chances to see President Bush in a let his guard down kind of way because I caught his presidency at the end, right? And he was just a little bit looser, a little bit more willing to go there, where President Obama wasn't. But I also saw times where, I mean, they both were. I promise you I'm not punting. I'm just thinking about examples where these guys are in the room, which is how a lot of presidencies are won. They're very good at making people laugh. And so, I told you the Bush story. I'll end with this story about President Obama. He cut a deal with Republicans and extended the tax cuts that the Republicans wanted in exchange for a lot of other things that were important to his agenda. And I asked a question of him in a press conference. When you take a stand and then you flip-flop like that, why should the American people ever believe anything you have to say? And he said, wait a minute, I didn't flip-flop. I'm talking about the what I can get done right now, the politics of the moment. I'm like, well, that's what I'm talking about. So we went at it for a bit. Right after that, I write my story, and then the White House was having its holiday party for the press corps, and you're allowed to invite one person. So I invited my mom, and I'm like a foot taller than my mom at least. So we're waiting in the queue, and as we get close, the room gets really small, diplomatic reception room. So, and there's lights and cameraman. So a military aide said, Ben Feller and his mom. And I walk up, and he just stares me down. I mean, we are this close. He goes, well, you sure started it off today. And I said, no, I thought it was good. He's like, you thought it was good? I go, yeah, I think I had to ask you that question. I think I covered you saying you weren't going to do it, and then you did it. I thought your answer was, very effective in getting out your side of it. And everybody heard it. And he looks at me for one more second, says something. I go, anyway, here's my mom. And he goes, oh, how are you? How are you? Oh, so good to see you. And he immediately went back into like charm mode, And so there's this picture of my mom and me and the president and the first lady. You'd never know, And so they both had this ability to push, to prod, to challenge, to laugh. I wish, to answer your question, and sort of I wish I got to see both of them in those later moments. I tried that a lot with President Bush's staff, and they said he's just been so burned. He used to, have people to his ranch and let his guard down, and his presidency ended on a bad note. But I did get to see it enough, and he got to know me. President Obama was just much more protective around it. But man, I did see some times where he's got a sharp sense of humor. So they both did.
What's just fascinating about that, though, is that it brings two things, to mind. One, there must have been this love-hate relationship at times between, anybody from the press and obviously President Net, because there is that part of you where you see this person so much that it's almost like, a coworker, a friend, however you want to say it. But then on the other hand, you have to ask the tough questions. So they're probably also like, it makes me think of Ted Lasso now when, whenever he's up in front of those people, and I forget the individual's name in there who usually comes at it with the hard questions, but it's like eventually they grow their relationship in the end. But that's this interesting balance.
Yeah, no, there is. Look, the most important thing is again, it's not about us or them, it's about the audience. And so if you got to have fidelity to asking tough, smart, fair questions that are not always going to stand you well, even if they're the right questions. And sometimes they think they're absolutely the wrong questions. But over time, you build credibility. I think one of the best compliments I ever got, it's a little bit salty, but when I went to the same dinner I was just describing, but it was when President Bush was in office, and I had been on the beat for, I think, 2 weeks. I didn't know anybody. The pressure I felt was immense covering the White House for the AP, except I knew one guy. I knew one guy named Kevin Sullivan, who had been at the Department of Education when I covered education. He went over to be President Bush's final communications director. And I said his nickname was Sully. I'm like, Sully, you got to at least introduce me to some people and vouch for me. You don't have to vouch for me as a good guy, just the credibility of a really good reporter, you know? And he's like, okay, I'll introduce you to the chief of staff. He hates these things anyway. I'll probably be standing in the corner. So I go through and I introduce my mom to President Bush, and, you know, we go upstairs in the East Room. There's this huge display of food and whatever. So we're sitting there. We finally get a table, and he comes over. He's like, Ben, we got to go. We got to go. And he's like, if you want to be the chief, now's your chance. And he's working with the urgency of an AP reporter. And like, you asked for this, you got to go. And I go, Sully, okay, but I just sat down with my mom, and he goes, oh, is this your mom? You know, something about the moms, right? And he's like, oh, hi, I'm Kevin Sully. He goes, your son has mastered the art of being a pain in the ass without being a son of a bitch. You know, like, how do you do both?
Yeah.
How do you do both? And that's what I tried to do, because ultimately, you know, we're telling these stories. These are years later. I think if you talk to these folks now, they're not going to remember the story that day. They're going to remember what it was like to work with me. And that's how relationships build in politics and in business and in life, you know.
Maya Angelou quote, is that what it is? The people don't remember what you say, they'll remember how you made them feel. Something along those lines. Yeah.
That's great.
Powerful. Yeah.
Well, Ben, what is the most or best place people can find you?
You know, I'm active on LinkedIn. So if your listeners are too, you'll see how to reach me to set up a call. You'll see background on my company. And if anybody is interested in the book I wrote, Big Problems, Little Problems, I have a website that is exactly what I just said, bigproblemslittleproblems.com. You can figure out the background on the book, and anybody who wants to get in touch with me who enjoyed this conversation, please do. But I just want to say thanks to both of you. A lot of fun to talk about language and life with both of you.
No, appreciate it. And we'll make sure to actually link to all of those in the podcast episode, so nobody has to actually remember it. But this has been a fascinating, engaging, and just fun conversation. So thank you for giving us your time today.
And I can only imagine if there was a book about your time, like when I think back at it, like just the stories you shared now, and I just can only imagine again as you described it. But then it's so exciting to think about this chapter now that you're building out too, because once more, being a fly in some of these rooms, it's got to be a pretty incredible experience. So thank you for sharing it with us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. A lot of fun to bring it back with both of you. So I'm going to go home and see what my son's up to, but I'll chat with you again. Thanks.
Thank you
Tell
so
me,
much.
Dr. Strange.
Okay.
We'll see everybody on the next one. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, guys.